Alta Cobb had washed for 60 men on the Salt Fork for 2 years. She hauled the water before light. She split her knuckles on the lie. She never once complained. And when the foreman docked her a ticket for a dozen shirts he swore she'd miscounted, she did not argue him. She just kept folding. Then it got worse. At the ranch store, in front of 2 hands and the man behind the counter, Foreman Cyrus Tull said it plain. "Tear up her wash tickets, Albert. She can't count. She'll never miss them." The storekeeper's hand hung over the paper. It hung there a long moment. And Alta said nothing at all. She watched every ticket she was handed after that. Watched them close. Then she went home. And she lifted a floorboard. If you believe quiet people read the fine print, this story is for you. Before we go on, subscribe and comment what state you're watching from. I want to see how far this one travels. Now, let me tell you about Alta Cobb. She came to the Caithness Land and Cattle Company in the fall of 1879. A widow, not yet 45, with a dead husband under the Texas grass, and no folks left to speak of. She did not come asking for charity. That was the first thing anybody learned about her. She came asking for work. The company ran cattle across a stretch of the Salt Fork near Halloran, and it ran men. 60 of them, most seasons. Cowhands and horsebreakers, and the boys who mended fence. Men who worked in dirt and slept in dirt and came off the range smelling like it. A ranch that size needs a laundress the way it needs a cook. And laundress was a paid trade, a recognized one, the same as any other on the books. So they took her on. They gave her a little frame house at the edge of the compound, near the creek where the water ran. And Alta went to work. You have to understand what that work was. It was not soft. Before the sun cleared the flats she was up, and she was hauling. 2 buckets at a time from the creek, up the bank, into the big iron pots. Then the fire under the pots, coaxed from mesquite that never wanted to catch. Then the lye. She made her own soap from ash and grease, and the lye in it ate her hands. By that first winter her knuckles were split, and they stayed split. They cracked open in the cold and bled into the wash water, and she wrung them out and kept going. 60 men's clothes a week, shirts stiff with sweat and blood and tallow. Trousers a man had been thrown from a horse in. Long johns you could stand up in a corner. She scrubbed them on a board till the board wore smooth. She wrung them by hand. She hung them on lines that ran the length of her yard, and in a panhandle whined those lines cracked like rifle fire all day long. And she never complained. Not to the hands who brought their bundles, not to the cook, who was the nearest thing she had to a friend. Not to anybody. She'd nod, she'd take the wash, she'd give it back clean and folded square, and she'd take her pay. Now here is the thing about her pay. It was the way of that company, and a good many like it, that a hand did not get coin in his fist. He got tickets. Company tickets. Paper. 1 ticket for every dozen pieces Alta washed, and that ticket was worth 50 cents, and it was redeemable, but only at the ranch store. You could not spend it in town. You could not spend it anywhere but at Albert Sykes' counter, on Caithness flour and Caithness coffee and Caithness cloth at Caithness prices. That was how the company got most of its wages back before they ever left the place. Every one of those tickets was issued over the foreman's authority. Down at the bottom of each one was a mark. Tull's own hand, most times, or Sykes writing under Tull's say-so. It came to the same thing, a signature, an acknowledgement. This much work was done, and this much is owed, and here is our word on it. Alta never thought a great deal about the signature. Not at first. What she thought about was that she did not care to spend the tickets fast. She said as much once, offhand, to the cook, and it was the kind of thing you'd forget you ever said. "I never troubled to spend them all at once," she told him, wringing a shirt. "The store's dear. I'd sooner keep the paper than their flour." That was all. She'd sooner keep the paper. She said it the way you'd say the sky looked like rain, and the cook nodded and thought nothing of it, and neither did she, and neither, God knows, did Cyrus Tull. She kept the paper. It went in a tin, an old flour tin with the paint mostly gone off it, and she kept it on a shelf, and when she got a ticket she folded it once and dropped it in. That was housekeeping, nothing more. A tidy woman keeps her money where she can find it. Let me tell you about Cyrus Tull now, because you'll want to know the shape of him. Tull was the division foreman. That made him a small king. The Caithness Company was owned a long way off, owned, in truth, by a syndicate of gentlemen in Scotland, in a cold grey city called Dundee. Men who had never seen a longhorn in their lives, and never would. They put their money in American cattle, the way you'd put it in a bank, and they hired men like Tull to mind it for them. And out on the Salt Fork, 1,000 miles from anybody who could tell him no, Tull was the company. What he said was law. Who he paid got paid. Who he crossed off got crossed off. He was not a stupid man. That's important. He was a careful one, in his way. He kept his books clean and his kingdom quiet, and he liked them both that way. What he was a man who had decided some people mattered and some did not, and once he'd sorted you into the second pile there was no getting out of it. A cowhand who could ride and rope, that man mattered a little. A widow who washed shirts, that woman did not matter at all. She was furniture that moved. She was a thing that made his men's clothes clean and cost the company 50 cents a dozen to do it, and he begrudged her even that. And the surest sign of it, the thing that would ruin him, though he'd have laughed at you for saying so, was that Cyrus Tull believed a ticket was the worker's memory. He thought the paper was there so Alta wouldn't forget what she was owed. A little crutch for a simple woman's counting. It never once crossed his mind that the ticket was his memory, his word, his signature at the bottom, binding not her, but him, and behind him the company, and behind the company those cold gentlemen in Dundee. He didn't think that far. Why would he? She was furniture. The first time he took from her, it was small. It was so small you could have missed it. It was late in the winter of that second year. Alta brought a load back to the store to redeem, the way you did, and Tull happened to be at the counter going over Sykes's figures. He looked at her stack of tickets. He looked at the ledger where the week's wash was tallied. And he frowned, the way a man frowns who's found a discrepancy he was hoping to find. "You've turned in one too many, Alta," he said. "There's a dozen here doesn't match. Miscounted, I expect." Now, Alta had not miscounted. She never miscounted. She'd washed what she washed, and she knew it to the piece. But she stood there in that store with her split hands folded in her apron, and she looked at Tull, and she saw the whole thing plain. If she said she was right, he would say she was wrong, and he was the foreman, and Sykes would write down whatever Tull told him to write. There was no arguing arithmetic with the man who kept the book. "That arithmetic's plainly beyond her," Tull said to Sykes. "Not to her." Said it like she wasn't standing there. "Dock the ticket. Pay her for the rest. 50 cents. That's what it came to. He took 50 cents off a woman with bleeding hands, and he did it to prove he could, and to fix in his own head the idea that she was a thing that couldn't count. Alta took her short pay. She picked up the shirt on the counter that a hand had left to be mended, and she folded it, slow and square, corner to corner. And she said nothing. She walked home. But that night, when she got a look at the paper she'd been handed, she counted it twice. The second time was worse, because there was somebody there to see. It came in the middle of the season, when the work was hardest, and the men were on the range, and the wash never stopped. Tull, quietly, without telling a soul, changed the rate. He cut what a ticket redeemed. Not the 50-cent face of it, he was too careful for that would show in the books, but the price of the goods it bought. He raised the store prices just enough that a ticket bought less flour, less coffee, less cloth than it had the month before. It was a wage cut done sideways, so it wouldn't look like one. Alta noticed. Of course she noticed. She was the one thing on that ranch that watched every ticket. She came to the counter and she said, mild as milk, that the figures seemed to have moved, that her tickets weren't fetching what they had, and there was a boy there. Toby Greer. Young hand, 17 maybe, all elbows and hope, the kind of boy who wanted more than anything to be a real cowboy and was terrified of doing anything that might mark him otherwise. He was leaning on the counter waiting for his tobacco when Alta said her piece. Tull didn't even turn around all the way. You can't even read the figure, Alta, he said. And he laughed, just a little, to let the boy know it was all right to laugh too. Toby didn't laugh. But Toby looked away. He found something real interesting out the window, and he studied it hard. And he said nothing. And that was its own kind of answer. Alta saw the boy look away. She saw the whole arrangement of it, the foreman who could say anything, the boy who'd rather look out a window than be caught noticing, and something in her that had been just hurt turned into something colder and more patient. It turned into a debt. Not the 50 cents. A different kind of debt, the kind that gets written down somewhere a foreman can't reach. She went home. She counted her paper. She put the new ticket in the tin. And then came the day it went past bearing, the day the title of this whole sorry business was spoken out loud, in a room full of witnesses, by a man too sure of himself to hear what he was saying. It was a bright, hard day, and the store was busy. Toby Greer was in there, and a second hand, an older fellow named Pruitt, and Albert Sykes behind his counter with his ledger open and his cash drawer under his hand. Alta had come in with a modest stack of tickets to redeem, needing flour, actually needing it, because a woman has to eat. Tull was there. He'd been in a foul humor all week. The syndicate's spring accounting was coming. The gentleman in Dundee sent a man up every spring to go through the books before the cattle shipped, and Tull wanted his kingdom spotless before that man arrived. He wanted no loose paper, no ragged columns, nothing that needed explaining. And here came the laundress with her fistful of tickets, wanting to be paid, cluttering up his clean books with 50-cent obligations. He looked at her stack on the counter. He looked at her. And the meanness in him, the sure hard meanness of a man who has never once been made to answer for anything, came up and out. Tear up her wash tickets, Albert. He said it flat, like ordering a horse shot. She can't count, she'll never miss them. The store went quiet. Sykes stopped. His hand was on the paper, on Alta's little stack, and it did not move. He looked at Tull and he looked at the tickets, and his throat worked. Because Albert Sykes was not a brave man, but he was a bookkeeper, and somewhere down under his fear there was a small voice that knew you do not just tear up money. Cyrus, Sykes started. Lo, these are... Did you not hear me? Tull's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Tear them up. She can't count. She'll never miss them. And Albert Sykes, God forgive him, tore some up. Not all of them. His hand shook, and he got through a few, ripping them across and letting the halves fall, before Alta reached out and, quiet, unhurried, drew the rest of the stack back off the counter and into her apron pocket. The ones he hadn't got to. She gathered them the way you'd gather eggs. Careful of the shells. She looked at nobody. She didn't look at Tull, didn't give him the anger he was fishing for. She didn't look at Toby, who had gone white, or at Pruitt, who was studying his boots, or at Sykes, whose face had gone the color of tallow. She turned around, and she walked out of that store into the bright, hard day, and the screen door slapped shut behind her. And behind her she left 4 witnesses. Sykes, Toby, Pruitt, and Tull himself, who thought he'd just settled a small nuisance, and had in fact just opened an account he would spend the rest of his life unable to close. That was the last straw. Understand, There wasn't going to be a fifth offense. She'd taken the small one and the sideways one, but this one, the public one, the tearing of her own paid work in front of grown men, this was the one that decided her. Not to shout. Not to weep. To decide. That night, she did the thing you saw at the start. She waited till her fire was down, and her house was dark and quiet. She got down on her knees on the plank floor by her bed, in the corner where a board had always sat a little loose. She worked her split fingers into the crack, and she lifted it. Underneath was the bare dark earth of the salt fork, dry and cool. She took the flour tin down off the shelf. She set it in the hole beneath the floor, and into that tin she put every ticket she still had, the ones she'd carried out in her apron that day, the ones already in the tin from months back, every scrap of company paper she owned, gathered together in the dark. Then she fit the board back over it and pressed it flat, and you couldn't tell a thing. From that night on, she redeemed nothing. Not a single ticket. She'd take her pay from Sykes, the same as always, 1 ticket per dozen washed, and she'd fold it once and carry it home, and it would go under the floor with the rest. She'd buy her flour and her coffee elsewhere when she could. From a peddler, from the cook's own stores, from anywhere but that counter. Whatever it cost her to do without, she did without. And she kept washing. That's the part that folks miss when they tell this story. She didn't quit. She didn't slack. She washed those 60 men's clothes exactly as she always had, up before light, water hauled, lye biting her hands, lines cracking in the wind. To look at her, you'd have thought nothing on earth had changed. She was just as steady, just as quiet, just as much the furniture that moved. Tull looked right through her the same as ever, and never saw a thing. But something had changed under the floorboards of that little house. Every week it got heavier by a few slips of paper, and every one of those slips had Cyrus Tull's mark at the bottom of it. Now let me tell you the thing Tull didn't know. The thing that would have made him lie awake, if he'd had the wit to fear it, because this is where the whole business turns, and if you understand it, you'll see it coming the way Alta saw it. Tull thought a ticket was the worker's receipt, her little scrap to remember by, something a simple woman kept so she wouldn't forget she was owed, and something that, torn up, simply stopped existing. No paper, no claim. Gone. That's why the order made sense to him. Rip up her memory. And the debt goes with it, because in his mind, the debt lived on her side of the counter. But that's not what a ticket is. That's not what it ever was. A company ticket like that is a note of hand. It's the employer's paper, not the worker's. When Tull, or Sykes under Tull, wrote out a ticket and marked it and handed it across, the company was not giving Alta a keepsake. The company was signing a written admission. It was putting in writing, we received this work, this specific quantity, 12 pieces washed, and we acknowledge we owe 50 cents for it, and here is our mark to prove we said so. The signature at the bottom doesn't bind the laundress. It binds the man who signed it, and the company behind him, which means the debt does not live on her side of the counter at all. It lives on his. The paper is his word, held in her hand. And here's the sharp edge of it, the thing that turns an insult into a noose. Tearing up a signed note of hand does not erase the debt. It cannot. The work was still done. The obligation still exists. All that tearing it up does, all it does, is create a new fact. It manufactures proof. Now there is not just a debt. There is a debt that was acknowledged in writing, and then ordered destroyed on purpose, out loud, in front of the very storekeeper, who has to answer to the company for every cent in his drawer. You cannot unowe a thing by ripping up your own promise to pay it. You can only prove that you knew you owed it and tried to make the evidence disappear. And if a single ticket survives, if even one slip with that signature on it comes through, it doesn't just stand for 50 cents, it stands for the whole rotten arrangement. It stands as proof that the company's own foreman was voiding the company's own signed obligations and hiding it from the company's own books. Alta understood that. Maybe not in those exact lawyer's words, but she understood the bones of it, the way a woman who's kept her own count for 2 years understands it. She understood that the paper under her floor wasn't her memory. It was Tull's confession 300 times over, if she let it grow that far. And every week, Tull's own hand, or his order to Sykes, added another page to the confession, and he thought he was just paying the laundress. So here is what she did not do. She did not go to Tull and argue. She'd learned there's no arguing arithmetic with the man who holds the pen. She did not go over his head and write a letter to Dundee, a widow's letter to gentlemen in Scotland, which would have been read by Tull's friends before it ever crossed the sea, if it crossed at all. She did not quit and walk off, which is what he'd have wanted, which is what would have let him say she'd run off and lost her silly tickets. She did not petition. She did not weep in front of anybody. She did not do a single one of the loud, useless, satisfying things a wronged person is supposed to do. She did one cold, patient, deliberate thing. She chose the day. She knew the syndicates sent a man up every spring before the cattle ship to go through the books. A factor, they called him. An accountant with the owner's full authority, sent from Dundee to make sure the gentleman's money was where the foreman said it was. And she knew, this was the whole heart of it, that this man would be a stranger. He would come up from Scotland having never shaken Cyrus Tull's hand. He would owe Tull nothing. He would not have drunk with him or ridden with him or borrowed from him. He would care about exactly one thing, whether the books he was sent to check would survive the eyes of the directors in Dundee, and a stack of signed company obligations that the foreman had ordered destroyed to hide them. That was precisely the kind of thing that would not survive those eyes. So Alta decided she would wait. She would keep the tin shut and the floorboard down, and her mouth closed, all through the fall and the winter and into the spring, however many months it took. She would let the tickets pile up, week by week, signature by signature, until the factor came. And then, and only then, on the one day when the right man was in the right room, with the authority to act and no reason on earth to protect Cyrus Tull, she would open the floor and bring out the tin. That was the act. Not a confrontation. A choosing. The decision to wait, to hold her fire, to trust the season to bring the right stranger to the salt fork, that was the point past which she would not turn back. She set her course by a man she'd never met, coming on a boat she'd never see, and she settled in to wash shirts until he arrived. It was about 150 days off, 150 days of hauling water and splitting her hands and saying good morning, Mr. Tull, civil as you please, while under her floor the case against him got heavier every single week. She only worried about one thing. Just one. She worried, in the dark, that 150 days was a long time to keep a thing quiet, and that the danger wasn't Tull finding out. The danger was that she'd trust the season too far, that she'd wait so patiently, so perfectly, for the day she'd chosen, that some other hand would reach the tin first. Because Albert Sykes had a cash drawer to balance, and a column in his ledger that would not stop growing, and spring was coming for him too. The first silent cycle passed without incident, which was almost worse than trouble. Albert Sykes had always been a careful man, careful the way men are careful when they are not naturally brave. He kept his drawer in good order. He noted everything twice. He had worked the Salt Fork store for going on 4 years, and had never once let a column go unreconciled past the end of a month. It was his one vanity, his one small pride, and it was now quietly killing him. Because there it was, at the bottom of the page, outstanding company tickets, never redeemed, growing by 12 every week like a vine up a fence post. In September it was 24. By October it was past 60. He knew whose name they were issued under, and he knew why she wasn't bringing them in. He didn't know what she meant to do with them, but he knew enough. He'd been in that store. He'd heard Tull say it. He'd torn the paper himself, the ones already in his hand, before she'd walked out, and the ones she'd kept in her apron he hadn't been able to touch. He mentioned it once to Tull, in the careful, sideways manner of a man who wants to raise a problem without seeming to raise it. "Got a long column of outstanding tickets in the Alta Cobb account," he said, running his finger down the page. "Never brought back in. Adds up." Tull barely looked up from the saddle he was checking. "She can't count, Albert. She's lost them or spent them on lint, or she's sitting on them because she's forgot they're worth a nickel. Leave it." And there it was. His contempt was the lock on his own trap, and he walked away and left the key in it. Sykes said nothing more. He wrote the column down, and down again the next month, and he did not feel better about it. A man with a conscience and no courage is a man who does everything right except the one thing that would cost him something. And Sykes balanced his ledger and went home and slept badly, and came in and balanced it again. By November the column was past 100 tickets. By December it was edging toward 150. Alta kept washing, 60 men's worth of shirts and drawers and heavy wool socks, week after week, the same as ever. She greeted Tull civil. She drew her new tickets at the going rate. Whatever rate he'd set that week, she took without comment. She spent just enough at the store to seem as though she were spending them, buying small things. Salt and thread, never enough to reduce the column by anything that mattered. She was adding to it, and she knew it, and Sykes knew it, and only Tull, protected by his own low opinion of her arithmetic, did not. By January the tin under the floorboard was heavy in a way flour never made it. She lifted the board some nights just to look. Not to gloat. She wasn't built for gloating. She lifted it the way a woman checks a sleeping child, to be sure the thing she was counting on was still there and still breathing. The tickets lay flat inside, curled a little at the edges from the damp of her hands. Each one a slip of company paper, each one with a mark at the bottom. Some carried Tull's own hard scrawl. Some carried Sykes's hand set down under Tull's authority, which came to the same thing in the end. She had learned that much sitting quiet through 2 years of wash. The paper wasn't hers. That was the part Tull never understood. He thought a ticket was her memory, a thing she'd forget or lose or spend on lint. He never once thought of it as his word. But that's what it was. A note of hand, an employer's written, say so that a dozen shirts came in clean and a dozen went out folded, and that 50 cents was owed against it, payable at the store. Her name wasn't even on most of them. His authority was. Tear one up, and you didn't erase the debt. You made a witness of the tearing. You put your own signature on the fact that the debt had been real, and owned, and then thrown in the stove in front of a storekeeper who'd have to answer for the drawer. She didn't say any of that out loud. There was no one to say it to who wouldn't carry it back. So she kept it behind her teeth, and she kept washing. 60 men. Every week. The same as ever. She'd settled on the day already, though the day was still months off. Not a confrontation, not a letter to the company, not quitting in a temper and slamming a door that had no one behind it. She would wait. That was the whole of her plan, and it was harder than any of the loud things would have been. She would keep the tin shut until the syndicate's man came up from Dundee for the spring accounting. She knew he came. Every year before the cattle shipped, a factor rode in from Scotland to go through the books. A man who'd never shaken Cyrus Tull's hand. A man who owed Tull nothing, liked Tull nothing, needed Tull's small kingdom to balance so his own directors an ocean away wouldn't ask him hard questions. That was the man. She would wait for that man, and set her paper in front of him, and let his arithmetic do what her word never could. The choosing of that day was the only choice she made. Everything after was patience. Winter went slow. The salt fork froze along its edges, and the wind came flat off the caprick with nothing to stop it. She hauled her water before light, cracked the skim of ice on the barrel. Split her knuckles on the lie, same as always. Toby Greer brought his shirts on Fridays now, and couldn't meet her eye when he did. That told her the store thing sat on him. Good, let it sit. A boy who couldn't look at you was a boy still growing a conscience, and she had a use for a conscience come spring. Cyrus was the one she watched from the corner of her mind. He had his ledger, and his ledger had her column, and the column was a live thing in his store. Growing every week, she took a ticket and didn't bring it back. By February, it was past 150. She heard, secondhand, the way you hear anything on a ranch, that he'd raised it with Tull a second time. That Cobb account's still open, he'd said, careful, sideways, nothing coming back against it. And Tull had told him again what he'd told him in November. She can't count, Albert. She's forgot the paper's worth a nickel. Leave it. That was the thing about Tull. His contempt did her work for her. Every time Cyrus got close to worried, Tull talked him back off it with the same low opinion that was quietly hanging him. A wiser man would have called her in, would have said, Alta, bring me your tickets, let's square you and be done. And she'd have had to hand them over one at a time and watch her evidence go back into the drawer. But Tull couldn't imagine she had a reason. A woman keeping paper on purpose was past what he could think. So he waved Cyrus off, and Cyrus went home and slept badly, and the tin under her floor got heavier. She near enough loved him for it. Some nights. In the way you love a man walking backward toward a cliff he keeps telling you isn't there. The tin filled toward 300. There was a bad week in March. Tull started tidying for the audit early, going through the store's back room with Cyrus, pulling old paper. She heard about it, and her stomach went cold for a day. He was in the ledgers. He was in the outstanding column. If he took a mind to cancel it all clean before the factor came, to make his books show nothing owed. But he didn't. Not then. He looked at the column, she gathered, and he did the exact thing his pride made him do. He decided it was nothing. A pile of paper a fool woman had lost track of, not worth the ink to reconcile. He told Cyrus to leave it lie till after shipping and they'd write it off then. And Cyrus, God bless his cowardly careful soul, stalled. Said the audit ought to see the books as they stood. Said Kerr would want them raw, not tidied. That was the near miss, and it passed, and the paper trail thickened instead of thinning. 300 tickets now. 300 admissions, 300 little places where the outfit had written down, in its own hand, that it owed her. Behind the outfit the whole Caithness syndicate, and behind the syndicate a man in Dundee who signed the factor's wages. Tull was just the agent. He kept forgetting that. The signature at the bottom of every slip didn't bind Alta Cobb the laundress. It bound the company he worked for. He'd been signing the company's word away 12 dozen shirts at a time and calling it her forgetfulness. Then, in April, he tried the other thing. The quiet thing. He came to her door of an evening. That in itself was strange enough that she wiped her hands and stood in the frame and didn't ask him in. He had his hat in his hand, which he never did, and his voice had gone smooth in a way that meant he'd rehearsed it on the walk over. Alta, he said, you've been at this 2 years. Hard work, cold work. I've thought maybe it's run its course for you. She waited. There's younger women take the wash. No shame in a body wanting to move on. He reached in his coat, brought out a small poke, and she heard the coin in it shift. I'd see you started somewhere. Settle up any little odds between us, friendly, and you go on with something in your hand instead of a lot of old paper. Call it $30 and we're square, and I wish you well. $30 against 150 in her floor. He didn't even know his own arithmetic. Or he knew it and thought she didn't, which was the same story he'd been telling since the day she came. She looked at the poke. She looked at his hat going round and round in his hands, and she understood he'd sensed something. Some animal sense that the ground under him had shifted, And this was him trying to buy his way off it cheap before he understood why. "That's kind of you, Mr. Tull," she said. "Even, no heat. But I'm not looking to leave just yet. I've got wash on the line." His jaw worked. For a second the smooth slid off him, and the other things showed underneath. Then he put the poke away and set his hat on his head and told her, cold now, that a woman ought to know when a good offer's the last one. And he walked off into the dark. She shut the door and stood against it a while. Her heart was going, not from fear, from how close it had been. $30 was a great deal of money to a woman with split knuckles, and there'd been a moment, one honest moment, where the tired part of her wanted to take it and be done. She hadn't. She'd kept her arithmetic. That was all she'd ever kept. Only her arithmetic, and the paper he kept signing. Word came the second week of April. Kerr was up from the railhead. The factor was at headquarters, and the accounting would open Thursday. And that was when Tull got frightened enough to be dangerous. Sykes told her himself, which was how she knew the storeman had crossed over at last. He came to her house at noon on Wednesday, gray in the face, and stood where Tull had stood. "He's told me to write them off," Sykes said. "All the outstanding. Told me to reconcile the store books tonight and show every open ticket canceled, so Kerr sees clean paper tomorrow. Show nothing owed." He swallowed. "Your whole column, Alta. He wants it gone off my ledger by morning." There it was, the one thing that could still sink her. If Sykes did as he was told, if he ran his pen through the store's own record of the debt, then tomorrow when she set her tin down, there'd be nothing to match it against. Her 300 tickets would be a woman's word against a foreman's clean book. Tull would say she'd forged them, or hoarded worthless voided slips. And the store's own ledger would agree with him. Her paper needed his paper. That was the hinge of the whole thing, and Tull, blundering, had found the hinge. She didn't beg. She'd learned long ago that begging moved a certain kind of man the wrong way. She just looked at Albert Sykes standing gray in her door with his hat in his hands like the other one, and she said the true thing. "If you cancel that column tonight, Albert, you'll be the man who falsified the books the night before the audit, not Tull. Your hand on the pen. And when it comes out, and it'll come out, because I'll still have every slip, it won't be his drawer that's short. It'll be yours to answer for." Sykes said nothing. "You've balanced that ledger honest every month of your life," she said. "Don't let him make you a liar in the last hour before the one man who can't be charmed comes to read it." He stood there a long moment. Then he put his hat on. He didn't say he'd keep the books straight. He didn't say anything at all. But he went back to the store, and he didn't reconcile a thing that night, and in the morning the column stood exactly as it had. $150 of open paper, raw and unwritten off, laid out for the factor to see. His conscience and his fear had finally pointed the same direction. That was the only way a man like Sykes ever moved. She'd known it, and she'd waited for it, same as she'd waited for the season. Thursday came clear and cold. The accounting was held in the headquarters office, a plank-floored room with a big desk and a window that looked out on the corrals. Kerr sat behind the desk. He was a spare man, past 50, in a good coat gone shiny at the elbows, with spectacles he took off to look at faces and put on to look at figures. Tull stood to the side of the desk in his best vest. Easy, the master of his small country welcoming inspection. Sykes hovered by the wall with his store ledger under his arm. Toby Greer had been called in to speak to some tally of the spring gather and stood by the door turning his hat. Alta came in last. She'd been sent for as a matter of the wage book, one of the accounts to be settled before shipping. Tull expected, she supposed, a wage complaint, a woman come to whine about her nickels. He gave her a look that said as much. Half a smile, already composing the there, he'd hand the factor afterward. She didn't complain. She didn't say a word. She walked to the desk, and she set the flour tin on it. And she stepped back. For a moment, nobody spoke. The tin sat there, dented, a rim of old flour dust white in its seams, incongruous as a hen on a church pew. Kerr looked at it over his spectacles. Then he looked at her. "And this is?" "My tickets, sir," Alta said. "For the wash. 2 years of them." Tull made a small sound, the beginning of a laugh, the beginning of "she can't even," but Kerr had already reached out and pried the lid, and the lid came off, and he looked down into 2 years of curled company paper packed edge to edge, and the laugh died in the room before it was born. Kerr didn't hurry. That was the terrible thing about him, from Tull's side of the desk. He was a man who'd come a long way to be thorough. And he was going to be thorough. He tipped the tin and let the tickets slide out onto the desk in a soft heap, and then he began to sort them. Into stacks. Counting under his breath, in that flat Scots murmur, the way a man counts who has counted a great many things and trusts nothing until he's counted it himself. 20, he said, and set a stack square. 40, 60, the room held still. Tull's easy stance had gone stiff at the shoulders. 100, 140, 180. His fingers didn't slow. 240, 280. He squared the last short stack. 300, said Andrew Kerr. 300 tickets, near enough. He looked up. "Mr. Sykes, what does a ticket redeem for at the store?" 50 cents, sir." Sykes's voice cracked and caught. 1 ticket, 1 dozen pieces washed, 50 cents against it. Kerr set his spectacles and did the sum out loud, slow, so every man in the room could follow it and no man could pretend he hadn't. 300 at 50 cents. A pause. $150. Acknowledged owing to this woman by the company's own paper. He lifted 1 ticket and turned it to the light. Signed at the bottom. "Every one I've looked at, signed." He looked at the mark. "Whose hand is that, Mr. Sykes?" Sykes swallowed. "Some's mine, sir, under the foreman's authority. And some's the foreman's own. And your store ledger." Kerr held out his hand. Sykes came off the wall and laid the book open on the desk, and Kerr ran his finger down the outstanding column, and then he laid it beside the stacks of tickets. And the number at the bottom of Sykes's honest column and the number in the heap of paper were the same number, and everyone in the room could see they were the same number. "They match," Kerr said. Almost to himself. "The paper and the book. They match to the ticket." Then he took off his spectacles and looked at Cyrus Tull for the first time. "There is a thing I don't understand yet," he said, mild as milk. "So help me to it. This is $150 of the company's acknowledged debt to a working woman, unredeemed, sitting open on the store's own ledger the day I arrive. Why has it not been paid? A ticket's meant to be brought to the store and cashed. Why has this woman 2 years of them in a flour tin?" And here Alta spoke. "Once. Because it was time. Because I was told they'd be torn up, sir." Kerr turned his head. "Torn up. In the store. Last fall." She kept her voice level as a table. "The foreman told the storekeeper to tear up my wash tickets. In front of witnesses. Said I couldn't count and I'd never miss them. Mr. Sykes tore the ones in his hand. I kept the ones in my apron, and I kept every one after." The room went very quiet. Kerr set the spectacles down on the desk. He didn't raise his voice. He'd never once raised his voice, and he didn't now, and that was worse than any shout could have been. "Mr. Tull," he said, "did you order a storekeeper to destroy signed company obligations?" Now it detonated in Tull, in real time, the whole shape of it arriving in him at once. Everyone watched it come. He opened his mouth on the old road. The only road he had, the one he'd traveled 2 years without a toll. "She can't even," he started. "She can't count. This is a lot of old. She doesn't understand what a—" and the sentence died in his mouth. You could see the moment it died. You could see the exact second Cyrus Tull understood what he had signed 300 times. That every slip he'd scrawled his authority across wasn't her memory to lose. It was his word. The company's word. His own hand, 300 times, admitting the work was done and the money owed. And then, in front of a storekeeper, ordering that admission fed to the stove. He hadn't erased a thing. He'd manufactured the proof. He'd signed his own accounting, 12 dozen shirts at a time, and handed it to the one woman patient enough to keep it in a tin under her bed. The insult was the signature. She couldn't count. He was the one who couldn't. He'd counted her too cheap by exactly $150, and now the man from Dundee was holding the difference. No one shouted. That was the thing she remembered after. There was no scene. There was only Tull with his mouth open and nothing in it, and the silence in the room was his. All of it. And he had to stand in the middle of it while the factor turned away from him, as from a thing already settled. Mr. Sykes, Kerr didn't look at Tull again. You tore some of these. On whose order? And what day? Sykes stood straight for the first time in the whole affair. His voice didn't crack now. A man let out from under a thing stands taller, and Sykes stood taller. On Mr. Tull's order, sir, in the store. The fall of last year, about the time we brought the beeves down off the North Grass. He said them words, tear up her tickets, she can't count. I tore what was in my hand. God forgive me, I did it. And I've carried that column on my books ever since, because I couldn't make it come out any other way but true. He drew a breath. My drawer's been short the sense of it for 8 months, sir. It balances now. The truth balances it. Kerr nodded once, slow. Then he looked at the boy by the door. You, Greer, is it? You were in the store. Toby had gone white. He was a boy who'd wanted to be a real cowboy and not a snitch, and had spent a winter learning that staying quiet wasn't the same as staying clean. He looked at the floor. He looked at Alta. And then he gave up the one honest sentence he'd owed since October. I heard him say it, sir, Toby said. Word for word like she told it. Tear up her wash tickets, she can't count, she'll never miss them. I heard it, and I didn't say nothing, and I should have. He turned the hat in his hands. That's all I know, but I know that. And that closed the account the title had opened. The foreman had told the storekeeper, in front of 2 hands. Now the storekeeper had answered, and one of the hands had answered, before the same eyes and a higher one. Everything spoken in that store came back around and was spoken again in this office, and this time it was written down. Kerr put the lid back on the empty tin and slid it across the desk toward Alta, gentle, like handing back a thing of value. Mrs. Cobb, he said, the company owes you $150 against its own paper, and I'll not have a repudiated signed debt writing in the syndicate's books when I go home to answer for them. It'll be paid out of this accounting, today, in coin. You'll count it yourself before you leave this room, and you'll tell me if it's short. Thank you, sir, Alta said. I'll count it. She let herself then one time. She turned and looked at Cyrus Tull, who had not moved, who stood by the desk in his good vest with the whole ruin of his small kingdom settling on him, quiet as snow, and she said the only thing she'd been saving. You were right that I never counted them. Mr. Tull, dry, even, not a drop of heat in it. I only kept them. Then she picked up her empty tin, and she waited to be paid. It went the way Kerr said. Within the week the money came, $150 in coin, and she counted it herself on the headquarters desk under the factor's eye, and it was not short by a cent. She put it in the tin. The tin that had held the paper now held the payment, and it was heavier with silver than it had ever been with promises. She gave her notice the same day she was paid. There was no drama in it. She simply told the new foreman, for Tull did not last out the spring, the syndicate being a thing that kept its own men only so long as they didn't cost it $150 and a fright, that she'd be taking her trade elsewhere, and she had somewhere to take it. That was the part that changed her life more than the coin did. 2 smaller outfits down the Salt Fork had long wanted a laundress and never had the pull to keep one. She went to them and set her own rate, cash, no tickets, and they took it glad. A woman who has just been paid 300 tickets at face is a woman with capital, maybe for the first time in her life, and capital lets you name your price instead of taking theirs. Sykes stayed on. His drawer balanced. He sent her the trade of the 2 outfits himself, quietly, the way he'd done everything quietly, and this time the quiet was on the right side of the ledger. A year on, if you'd ridden down the Salt Fork past Halloran, you'd have come on a lien to that was hers. Her own. Built with her own coin on a scrap of ground she paid for, and no man's authority sat at the bottom of. Lines of wash strung between 2 posts, cracking and snapping in that flat, dry panhandle wind that never once stopped blowing the whole time she lived there. 60 men's shirts still, more some weeks, but at her rate now, in her name. On a shelf inside, up where the damp couldn't reach it, sat the flour tin. It held coin these days. She kept it there not because she needed a bank, but because a woman likes to see the thing that carried her across the river, sitting dry on the far bank where the water can't touch it anymore. They said the syndicate kept its own books after that, sent a man up to do it proper, and didn't leave the small kingdom so small or so unwatched. What became of Cyrus Tull nobody bothered to write to her about, and she didn't bother to ask. A man like that lands somewhere and starts the same story over with someone he's decided can't count. She hoped, without much heat, that the next one kept her paper too, because that was the whole of what she'd learned, split-knuckled, over 2 cold years on the Salt Fork, and it's the thing worth carrying out of this. A ticket is not the worker's memory. It never was. It's the master's word, set down in the master's own hand. And a word, once it's on paper, belongs to whoever's patient enough to hold it. He thought the poor and the quiet don't read the fine print. She read every line. She just didn't say so until the one man came who'd make him read it too. If this one traveled far enough to reach you, tell me where you're watching from, comment your city, and let's see how far a widow's wash tickets can still carry.